guys, it's Sharon. Welcome back or welcome to my channel. This is a very bittersweet video in the sense where nothing about the topic in itself is bittersweet. More so the fact that this is the last episode in this series. So just last year I started a series called My Zodiac Serial Killers, which is this one exactly, where every single month, once a month, I talk about a serial killer who has the zodiac sign of that given month. So for example, right now we are in March, so I'm doing a Pisces serial killer, and this is the full circle episode. We have officially done every single astrology sign there is, so if you would like to go check out the rest of the episodes, definitely do so on my channel. It's in my playlist literally titled Zodiac Serial Killers, and if you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments below and give this a big thumbs up. I'm not sure if to maybe make like a Zodiac killer video, but if you guys want to see that, let me know, and of course subscribe for more if you want to see more. Also make sure to follow my Instagram, my Twitter, my TikTok, so you haven't seen my videos and get a chance to be in them and even get to be shout out of the day. Today's serial killer is not really a surprise, of course, from the title, and also because I mentioned I would be doing this one last episode. This one has been requested so many times, and I can sadly see why. He is probably one of the most infamous serial killers in the United States, and that is John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, and he is a Pisces. Now, before I get into this video, this is a warning. If you do not feel comfortable watching this, you definitely do not have to. I do talk about disturbing things such as murder. We're talking about serial killers. But for now, let's get right into this killer clown. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly dressed up as a clown and performed at children's hospitals and charity events. He used the names Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown. Because of this, he became known as the Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17th of 1942. He is the second of 3 kids and the only son of John Gacy and Marion Robinson. His father was an auto repair machinist and a World War I veteran, and his mom was a housewife. Gacy was close to his mom and his 2 sisters, but he had a very difficult relationship with his father. His father was a physically abusive alcoholic. His father also belittled him a lot, calling him dumb and stupid and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was of his father beating him with a leather belt for accidentally moving the pieces around of a car engine that his dad had put together. At age 6, he was beaten unconscious with a broomstick by his father. His mother tried to shield him from his father's abuse, which only resulted in his dad calling him a sissy, a mama's boy, and that he would probably grow up queer. Despite this, Gacy still loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, Gacy's father found out that his son and another boy had been caught sexually fondling a young girl. He whipped Gacy with a razor strap as punishment. That same year, a family friend who was also a contractor would sometimes molest Gacy in his truck. Gacy never told his dad about this though, because he was scared that his dad would blame him. Now, Gacy was an overweight and unathletic child. He had a heart condition and he was told to avoid sports at school. When he was 11, he was struck in the head by a swing set which caused a blood clot. Because of this, he was experiencing blackouts by 4th grade. He was hospitalized often and claimed that between the ages of 14 and 18, he spent almost a year in the hospital. He said missing school because of his hospital visits were the reasons for his poor grades. His father thought that he was faking it and even accused Gacy of faking his condition for attention and sympathy, while Gacy was laying in a hospital bed. His mother, sisters, and a few close friends never doubted his illness. In 1960, at the age of 18, Gacy got a job in politics, and his father accused him of being a patsy for this. A patsy is someone that is easily taken advantage of. Gacy got involved in politics to seek the approval of others, since he couldn't get that from his dad. That same year, his dad bought him a car, although the car was in his dad's name until Gacy could finish paying it off, which took a couple of years. He used this against Gacy, taking away his car keys unless his son did what he said. In 1962, Gacy purchased an extra copy of the car keys, and in retaliation, his dad removed the distributor cap, a very important car piece. Hours after his father replaced the distributor cap, Gacy left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada. He found work within the ambulance service before he was transferred to work as an attendant at a mortuary. He slept on a cot behind the embalming room and worked there for 3 months. Gacy confessed that one evening, while alone, he had climbed into the coffin of a teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This made him call his mom the next day and ask if his dad would let him come back home. His dad agreed, and that same day Gacy was on his way back to Chicago. When he was back home, he enrolled at Northwestern Business College despite not even graduating from high school. He graduated in 1963 and took a management trainee position with a shoe company. In 1964, that same shoe company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois. Here he worked as a salesman and was eventually promoted to manager in his department. In March of that year, he became engaged to his coworker, Marilyn Myers. While they were dating, Gacy joined the local Jaycees and worked worked tirelessly for them. He was named the Key Man in 1964. JCs are part of a leadership training and civic organization for people between the ages of 18 and 40. Also in 1964, Gacy had his second homosexual experience. He said one of his colleagues in the Springfield JCs gave him a lot to drink, invited Gacy to crash on his couch, then gave Gacy oral sex while he was drunk. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield JCs and was named the third most outstanding JC in the state of Illinois. Gacy and Myers married in September of 1964. At the time, Marilyn Myers' father purchased 3 KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' old home, which they vacated just for them. The offer was insane. Gacy would receive $15,000 a year, which as of 2022, that is a little over $134,000 a year. He also got a share of the restaurant's profits. After relocating to Waterloo, Gacy opened a club in his basement. This is where his employees could hang out and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes at his restaurants, he socialized only with the young men. Gacy gave many of them alcohol before he made any sexual advances, and if they rejected him, he would claim his advances were a joke or he was just testing their morals. Gacy's wife gave birth to a son in February of 1966 and a daughter in March of 1967. Gacy later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When Gacy's parents visited in July of 1966, his father privately apologized for all the physical and emotional abuse he ever caused Gacy. He shook Gacy's hand and said, "Son, I was wrong about you." Gacy joined the local JC's chapter in Waterloo. He and other Waterloo JCs were deeply involved in wife swapping, prostitution, porn, and drugs. In 1967, he was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs and served on the board of directors. In August of 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow JC. Gacy lured Voorhees back to his house with the promise of showing him the porn that they showed at JC events. He got Voorhees drunk, let him watch porn, then convinced him to engage in mutual oral sex, saying you have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with a woman. Over the following months, Gacy abused other young boys. He encouraged one to have sex with his own wife before blackmailing him into performing oral sex on him. He also tricked several teenagers into believing that he was paid to conduct homosexual experiments for research and paid them up to $50 each. In March of 1968, Voorhees told his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Voorhees Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him with performing oral sodomy on Voorhees and attempting to assault 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy denied the charges and demanded a polygraph test. The results indicated that Gacy was nervous when he denied any wrongdoing in relation to both boys. Gacy continued to deny the charges and said that they were politically motivated, all because Voorhees Sr. opposed Gacy's nomination for president for the Iowa JCs. However, on May 10th of 1968, Gacy was indicted for the sodomy charge. On August 30th of 1968, Gacy convinced one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, to physically assault Donald Voorhees. He wanted to scare him from testifying in court against him. Gacy promised to pay Schroeder $300. He agreed, and in early September, he lured Voorhees to an isolated country park, sprayed mace in his eyes, then beat him up. Voorhees escaped and reported his attack to the cops. He also identified his attacker, so Schroeder eventually confessed to attacking Voorhees under Gacy's orders. Police arrested Gacy and gave him an additional charge for this. On September 12th, Gacy had a psychiatric evaluation. 2 doctors examined him for 17 days, concluding he had antisocial personality disorder, which is just the clinical term for a sociopath or a psychopath, and they said that he was unlikely to benefit from any therapy or medication. They said his behavior pattern was likely to bring him into repeated conflict with society, although they did say he was mentally competent to stand trial. On November 7th of 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy in relation to Voorhees, but not guilty of other charges relating to other boys. He was convicted on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. That same day, Gacy's wife filed for divorce. She asked for their home and property, sole custody of their kids, and alimony. She won, and the divorce was finalized on September 18th, 1969. Gacy never saw his first wife or kids again. During his incarceration, Gacy was a model prisoner. Within months, he was the head cook. He joined the Inmate Gacy chapter and increased its membership. He also secured an increase in the inmates' daily pay in the prison mess hall and supervised projects to improve the conditions for inmates. By summer of 1969, Gacy had overseen the installation of a miniature golf course in the prison yard. Although in June of 1969, he was denied parole. He did finally get his high school diploma in November, though. On Christmas Day of 1969, Gacy's father died from liver complications. When informed of his father's death, Gacy collapsed to the floor sobbing. His request for supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral was denied. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months probation on June 18, 18th of 1970, after serving 18 months of his 10-year sentence. Conditions of his probation included that Gacy move back to Chicago and live with his mom, and have a curfew of 10 p.m. He arrived there on June 19th and got a job as a cook in a restaurant. On February 12th of 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy. The boy claimed that Gacy had lured him to his car, then driven him to his house, where he tried to force the boy into having sex with him. The complaint was dismissed when the boy failed to show up for court. On June 22nd, Gacy was arrested and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct. A young boy claimed that Gacy had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into his car, and then forced him to perform oral sex. These charges were dropped after the boy attempted to blackmail Gacy. The Iowa Board of Parole never heard of these incidents though, so 8 months later, in October of 1971, Gacy's parole ended. The following month, records of Gacy's previous criminal convictions were sealed. With help from his mom, Gacy bought a ranch house in the village of Norridge, Chicago. The address was 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, and it was where all the murders were committed. Now, Gacy was very active in his local community and was very neighborly. He lent his neighbors tools and he plowed their snow for free. Between 1974 and 1978, he hosted annual summer parties, which were attended by up to 400 people and even politicians. In 1971, Gacy established a part-time construction company. It was called PDM Contractors. This stood for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. With the approval of his probation officer, Gacy worked nights on his construction contracts and during the day as a cook. In mid-1973, Gacy quit his job as a cook to focus solely on his construction company. In August of 1971, Gacy became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he briefly dated in high school. They were married on July 1st of 1972. Carol and her 2 young daughters moved into Gacy's home, and his mother moved out before the wedding. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3rd of 1972. Gacy lured a 16-year-old boy named Timothy Jack McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. McCoy was returning from Christmas vacation in Michigan to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him back to his house with the promise of spending the night and then being driven back in time to catch his bus home. Gacy claimed he woke up the next morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway with a kitchen knife in his hand. He jumped from his bed, and McCoy raised both arms in surrender, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm while doing this. Gacy then twisted the knife from McCoy's wrist, banged his head against the bedroom wall, kicked him against his closet, and then walked towards him. He then kicked McCoy in the stomach, grabbed him, and shouted, "I'll kill you." He then wrestled McCoy to the ground and stabbed him in the chest repeatedly. Gacy then went to the kitchen and saw an open carton of eggs and unsliced bacon on the kitchen table that was set for 2. So McCoy had made breakfast and walked into Gacy's bedroom to wake him up. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a slab of concrete. He said that while he was stabbing McCoy, he realized that death was the ultimate thrill. His second murder was committed around January of 1974. This victim remains unidentified. Gacy strangled him and then placed the body in his closet before burying him. He later stated that bodily fluids leaked from the victim's nose and mouth and it stained his carpet. Because of this, he started stuffing cloth rags, the victim's own underwear, or a sock into their mouths to prevent leaking. On July 31st of 1975, John Butkovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee, disappeared. His car was found with his jacket and wallet still inside and the keys in the ignition. Remember, PDM is Gacy's company. The day before his disappearance, John had confronted Gacy about missing payment. John's dad called Gacy after John's disappearance, and Gacy claimed he was happy to help to search for John, but was sorry that his son had run away. When questioned by the police, Gacy said that John and 2 friends arrived at his house demanding the overdue pay, but they reached a compromise and the 3 left. Over the following 3 years, John's parents called the police over 100 times, urging them to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted to seeing John exiting his car and waving at him for attention. According to Gacy, John said he wanted to talk, which he assumed was about the missing payment. Gacy invited him in his car, then back to his place. At his home, Gacy offered John a drink, then tricked him into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. He sat on the kid's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed the body in his garage, intending to bury it in the crawl space, but his wife and stepdaughters got back home earlier than he anticipated, so he buried the body in the garage. By 1975, Gacy told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had sex on Mother's Day of that year, he told her this would be the last time they would ever have sex. He began spending most nights away from home, returning in the morning with the excuse that he had been working late. Carol watched Gacy bring teenage boys into their garage in the early hours and also found gay porn, men's wallets, and IDs in the house. When she confronted Gacy about these items, he got angry and said it was none of her business. In October of 1975, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed, and Carol and her daughters moved out by February of 1976. The divorce was finalized on March 2nd, the reason being Gacy's fake infidelity with women. By 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly, and Gacy was working up to 16 hours a day. In March of 1977, he became a supervisor for PE Systems, a firm specializing in the remodeling of drugstores. Between the two, Gacy worked up to 4 projects at the same time and traveled to a lot of different states. Gacy found out about a Jolly Joker clown club, where members performed at fundraising events and parades and entertained hospitalized children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the clown club and created his own clown characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He also devised his own makeup and costumes. Pogo was a happy clown, and Patches was a more serious character. Gacy's voluntary public service as a clown throughout the years of his murders is what gave him the nickname the Killer Clown. Gacy admitted not only was 1975 when PDM took off, but also when he began to increase the frequency of his sex with young males. He committed most of his murders between 1976 and 1978, mainly since he lived alone after his divorce. He referred to these years as his cruising years. Now, much of PDM's employees were high school students and young males. Gacy often propositioned his employees for sex or insist on sexual favors in return for financial assistance or promotions. For example, in 1973, Gacy and a teenage employee traveled to Florida to look at property that Gacy bought. He raped his employee in their hotel room the first night they were there. When back in Chicago, this employee drove to Gacy's house and beat him in his yard. Gacy told his wife that he had beat him up because he refused to pay for a poor quality paint job. In May of 1975, Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci. 2 months later, he went to Antonucci's home, knowing the boy injured his foot in an accident. The two drank a bottle of wine and watched some porn before Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and cuffed him. He cuffed his hands behind his back, but one cuff was loose, so as Gacy exited the room, Antonucci got the cuffs off. When Gacy returned, he pounced on him. He was a high school wrestler. He wrestled Gacy, got the handcuff key, and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. At first, Gacy threatened him and then promised to leave if he would remove the handcuffs. Antonucci agreed, and Gacy left. The month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. He was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6 of 1976. Gacy buried him under the dining room with a section of cloth lodged in his throat. 5 weeks later, on the afternoon of May 14th, 50-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared shortly after returning home from a dentist appointment. Hours after Reffitt was last seen by his family, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. He and Reffitt were close friends, and both were buried together in the crawl space. Investigators believe the two were murdered on the same evening. On June 3rd, Gacy killed a 17-year-old Michael Bonin. He disappeared while traveling. Gacy strangled him and buried him under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy murdered a 6-year-old William Carroll and buried him in a common grave in the crawl space. On July 26 of 1976, Gacy picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker David Cram. Gacy offered him a job with PDM, and he began to work that same day. On August 21st, Cram moved into Gacy's house. The next day, the two had several drinks to celebrate Cram's 19th birthday. Gacy was dressed as Pogo and tricked Cram into wearing cuffs in front of his body. He swung him around and told him he was going to rape him. Cram kicked Gacy in the face and freed himself from the cuffs. A month later, Gacy appeared at Cram's bedroom door intending to rape him. He said, "Dave, you don't really know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." Cram resisted and finally moved out on October 5th. He also left PDM, but he occasionally worked for Gacy here and there over the next 2 years. After Cram moved out, another employee, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved in. Rossi had worked for PDM since May of 1976 and lived with Gacy until April of 1977. Rossi sometimes assisted Gacy in dressing up as a clown for business openings, and he would be the one to dress up as Patches. On August 5th, a 16-year-old James Hackison is last known to have phoned his family, possibly from Gacy's home. He died of suffocation. His body was buried in the crawl space beneath the body of 17-year-old Rick Johnston, who was last seen alive on August 6th. Gacy is thought to have murdered 2 more unidentified males between August and October of 1976. On October 24th, he abducted and killed teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. The two were last seen outside a restaurant on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, 19-year-old William Bundy disappeared after telling his family he was going to a party. Bundy died of suffocation, and Gacy buried the body beneath his master bedroom. bedroom. He had apparently worked for Gacy. Between November and December of 1976, Gacy murdered a 21-year-old named Francis Alexander. His last contact with his family was a phone call made sometime in November to his mother. Alexander was buried in the crawl space directly beneath the room that Gacy used as his office. In December of 1976, another PDM employee, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik, disappeared. His girlfriend last saw him outside her house when he had driven her home after a date. Godzik had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks before he disappeared. He had informed his family that Gacy had him dig trenches for some kind of drain tiles in his crawl space. Godzik's car was later found abandoned, and his family contacted Gacy about his disappearance. Gacy claimed that he had run away from home, having indicated that he wished to do so beforehand. Gacy also claimed to have received an answering machine message from Godzik after he left, but when asked if he could play the message for Godzik's parents, Gacy said he had erased it. On January 20th of 1977, Gacy lured 19-year-old John Sick to his place. This was to talk about buying John's car. He strangled John in the spare bedroom, claiming that his roommate Rossi was asleep in the house the next morning. Gacy later sold John's car to Rossi for $300. On March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestige disappeared. He was last seen leaving a near Northside restaurant. He was buried in the crawl space above the body of Francis Alexander. Shortly before his disappearance, Prestige had mentioned that he found work with a local contractor. Gacy murdered one additional unidentified boy and buried him in the crawl space in the spring or summer of 1977. The exact time of the murder is unknown. On July 5th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Matthew Bowman. Bowman's mother last saw him at a train station where he was going to court over an unpaid parking ticket. The following month, Rossi was arrested for stealing gas while driving John Sick's car. The gas station noted the license plate, and the police traced the car back to Gacy's house. When he was questioned, Gacy told the officers that Sick sold the car to him back in February, saying he needed money to leave town. The police didn't pursue this further, although they did tell John Sick's mother that his son had sold his car. By the end of 1977, Gacy had murdered 6 more young men between the ages of 16 and 21. The first of these victims was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy. He was the son of a Chicago police sergeant and last seen alive on September 15th. Gilroy lived just 4 blocks from Gacy's home. He was murdered and buried in the crawl space. On September 12th, Gacy flew to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he did not return to Chicago until September 16th. Because Gacy was in another state at the time that Gilroy was last seen, this is used to support Gacy's claim that he had help from 1 or more accomplices during his murders, but no accomplices have ever been confirmed. 10 days after Gilroy was last seen, 19-year-old John Mowry disappeared after leaving his mother's house on his walk back home to his apartment. Gacy strangled Mowry and buried his body underneath the master bedroom. On October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson was looking for contracting work. Gacy murdered him and buried him beneath the guest bedroom. Less than 4 weeks later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old Robert Winch. He was buried in the crawl space. On November 18th, 20-year-old father of 1, Tommy Bowling, disappeared after leaving a Chicago bar. 3 weeks after the murder of Tommy Bowling, David Talsma disappeared after telling his mom he was going to a rock concert in Indiana. This was on December 9th. Gacy strangled Talsma with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space, close to the body of John Mowry. On December 30th, Gacy abducted 19-year-old Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy drove him to his house where he raped, tortured, and repeatedly dunked Donnelly's head into the bathtub until he passed out. Gacy taunted him by saying such things as, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" After several hours, Gacy drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him, warning him that if he complained to police, they wouldn't believe him. Donnelly later testified at Gacy's trial that he was in so much pain that he asked Gacy to just kill him, and Gacy responded with, "I'm getting around to it." Donnelly reported the assault, and police questioned Gacy on January 6 of 1978. Gacy admitted to having a slave sex relationship with Donnelly and that it was all consensual. The police believed him and didn't file charges. The following month, Gacy killed 19-year-old William Kindred. He disappeared on February 16th after telling his fiancée, who knew Gacy, that he was spending the evening at a bar. Kindred was Gacy's final victim, buried in the crawl space. On March 21st, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall to his car. He got in and Gacy chloroformed him and drove him to his house. There, he restrained him, saying he had complete control over him, and he intended to do whatever he wanted to him, when he wanted, and how he wanted. He then raped and tortured Rignall with various instruments, including lit candles and whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him into unconsciousness. Gacy then drove Rignall to Chicago's Lincoln Park, where he dumped him, while he was unconscious but still alive. Rignall managed to stagger to his girlfriend's apartment. Police were informed of the assault but did not investigate Gacy. Rignall was able to recall the car, expressway, and side streets he was at and around before his assault. assault. He and two friends staked out the Cumberland exit of the Kennedy Expressway, and in April, Rignall saw the Oldsmobile, which he and his friends followed to Gacy's home at 8213 West Somerdale. Police obtained an arrest warrant, and Gacy was arrested on July 15th. He faced a trial for battery against Rignall. By 1978, the crawl space didn't have any more space for more bodies. Gacy considered the attic, but leakage worried him. Instead, he disposed of victims off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy stated he had thrown 5 bodies into the river in 1978, one of which he believed landed on a passing freight boat. Only 4 bodies were ever found. The first known victim thrown from the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River was 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke. He was murdered in mid-June after leaving his apartment to buy cigarettes. Shortly before his disappearance, Timothy told his roommate that a contractor offered him a job. On November 4th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Frank Landigan. His naked body was found in the Des Plaines River on November 12th. On November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazara disappeared after having Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Mazara had informed his sister the day before his disappearance that he was working in the construction industry and doing all right. He was last seen alive walking in the direction of Bughouse Square carrying a suitcase. On the afternoon of December 11th of 1978, Gacy visited a pharmacy to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the store owner. While within earshot of the 15-year-old part-time employee, Robert Peist, Gacy mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 an hour, which was almost double the pay that Robert earned at the pharmacy. This might not sound like much, but remember this was back in the 70s. Shortly after Gacy left the pharmacy, Robert's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home so they can celebrate her birthday. Robert asked his mother to wait, saying that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. He left the store at 9 p.m. He was murdered shortly after 10 p.m. at Gacy's house. Gacy stated that while at his house, he tricked Robert into handcuffs before saying, "I'm going to rape you and you can't do anything about it," as Robert began crying. Gacy had a modus operandi, which is an MO, which is how he operated and how he murdered his victims. His victims were typically people he knew, like employees, or randoms he lured from the bus station, Bughouse Square, or just off the streets. He promised them a job with PBM, drinks or drugs, or money for sex. Some were grabbed by force, some just came with him, or some were tricked into believing that he was a cop when he showed his sheriff's badge. Once at Gacy's house, he would either give a boy a lot of alcohol or generally gain his trust. He would then pull out handcuffs to show him a trick, part of his clown routine. He would cuff himself, then release himself with the key he hid in between his fingers. He would then have the victim try it for themselves so he could teach them how to release themselves. When the victim was struggling, he would say something along the lines of, "The trick is, you have to have the key." He called this his handcuff trick. After the victim was restrained, Gacy would rape and torture them. He often sat on his victim's chest, crushing them. He would also torture them by burning cigars or making their victim act like a horse, and he would write on them. He'd even use violation with foreign objects. He frequently cuffed their ankles too, so they really couldn't get away. He is also known to verbally taunt his victims and either have them crawl or be dragged to the bathroom, where he partly drowned them in the bathtub before reviving them and repeating. He would strangle them with a rope, calling it his rope trick and his last trick. Several victims died from asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep in their throats. Except for his 2 final victims, all were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. He usually stored his victims' bodies under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them, usually in the crawl space. When his last victim, Robert Peist, failed to return home, his family filed a missing persons report with the Des Plaines police. The pharmacy owner named Gacy as the contractor that Robert had most likely gone to talk to about a job. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak was convinced that Robert had not run away from home. In a routine check of Gacy's criminal background, it was revealed that he had an outstanding battery charge against him in Chicago and had served a prison sentence in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. The lieutenant and 2 police officers visited Gacy at his home the following evening. Gacy was adamant that he had not offered Robert a job and that he returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. because he forgot his appointment book. He promised to go to the police station later that evening to make a statement. When questioned as to how soon he could come to the police station, he responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" At 3:20 a.m., Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud. He claimed that he had been involved in a car accident. He again denied offering Robert a job and said that the store owner, Phil Torf, had called him about his forgotten book, which is why he went back. Detectives already spoke to Phil Torf, though, who denied calling Gacy. At the request of the detectives, Gacy prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11th. Suspecting that Gacy might be holding Robert against his will at his home, the police obtained a warrant to search Gacy's home on December 13th. This search of Gacy's property revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges, handcuffs, several books on homosexuality and pedophilia, porn, several driver's licenses, drugs, a blue parka with a receipt from the pharmacy, underwear too small to fit him, and more. They even found a high school class ring with the initials JAS engraved on it. The police confiscated Gacy's Oldsmobile and any PDM work vehicles. Police assigned two-man surveillance teams to monitor Gacy on a rotational 12-hour basis. This was as they continued their investigation into his background, and of course his potential involvement in Robert's disappearance. Investigators received a phone call from Gacy's former roommate, Michael Rossi, informing them of Gregory Godzik disappearance, and the fact that another PDM employee, Charles Hatula, had been found drowned in an Illinois river earlier that year. On December 15th, investigators obtained further details of Jeffrey Rignall's battery charge against Gacy, the boy he lured, chloroformed, raped, tortured, and dumped. They also learned of the disappearance of John Butkovich and traced the school ring to John Allen Sick. By December 16th, Gacy was becoming cocky towards the surveillance detectives. He would invite them out to meals, even invite them out for drinks at the bar or even his home. He repeatedly denied that he had anything to do with Robert's disappearance and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections or his recreational drug use. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he taunted them by breaking traffic laws and succeeded in losing his pursuers more than once. Investigators conducted a formal interview of Michael Rossi on December 17th. He told them how Gacy sold Sick's car to him. That same day, a further examination of Gacy's car was conducted. They found small fibers of human hair and brought in search dogs. This was to see if Robert had been in any of Gacy's vehicles. One dog approached the Oldsmobile and laid in the passenger seat. This was a death reaction, indicating that Robert's body had been in that car. In the early hours of December 18th, Gacy invited detectives Mike Albrecht and David Hashmeister to a restaurant where over breakfast, he talked about his business, his marriages, and his activities as a registered clown. At one point during the conversation, Gacy said, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." By this time, Gacy was beginning to look strained from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, he looked tired, he appeared anxious, and he was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a civil suit against the police, demanding that they seize their surveillance. The same day, investigators traced the pharmacy receipt to 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a co-worker of Robert. She admitted that she wore the jacket on December 11th and placed the receipt in the pocket before giving the jacket to Robert, who said a contractor wanted to speak to him. This statement contradicted Gacy's previous statements, insisting that he had no contact with Robert on December 11th. Now, Michael Rossi was interviewed a second time on this day as well. He told detectives that in the summer of 1977, at Gacy's order, he had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of Gacy's house. On December 19th, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant of Gacy's house. Gacy's lawyers also filed a civil suit against the police on this day. This suit was set for December 22nd. Now, this same afternoon that it was filed, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives inside his home. As Officer Robinson distracted Gacy with conversation, Officer Schultz walked into Gacy's bedroom. While flushing Gacy's toilet, the officer noticed a smell he suspected to be that of rotting corpses coming from the heat duct. Investigators interviewed both Cram and Rossi on December 20th, both who used to be Gacy's roommates. Rossi took a polygraph test and denied any involvement in Robert's disappearance, also denying any knowledge about his whereabouts. He refused to continue with questioning, though. However, Rossi did further discuss the trench digging he did in Gacy's crawl space. Cram informed investigators of Gacy's attempt to rape him in 1976. When asked if he had been to the crawl space, Cram replied he had once been asked to spread lime down there and also dug trenches, which Gacy had explained that they were for drainage pipes. Cram stated that these trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep, the size of graves. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office for a meeting. Gacy looked disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink. When his lawyer asked what he wanted to discuss, Gacy picked up a copy of the Daily Herald from his desk, pointed to a front-page story about Robert, and said, "This boy is dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that ran into the early early hours of the following morning. He began by informing Sam Emirante and Leroy Stevens he had been the judge, jury, and executor of many, many people, and now he wanted to be the same for himself. He said he buried most of his victims in his crawl space and had disposed of the 5 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars to which he gave the rope trick, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead strangled kids on his bedroom floor, with their hands cuffed behind their backs. He had buried their bodies in his crawl space as he believed that they were his property. He drank so much he fell asleep midway through his confession. His lawyer immediately arranged a psychiatric appointment for Gacy for 9 a.m. After waking up several hours later, Gacy shook his head when his lawyer told him that he had confessed to killing approximately 30 people. He said, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do." Then he left their office to attend the needs of his business. Gacy said his last free day was hazy. He spent it visiting his friends and saying his last farewells. He drove to a gas station and filled his rental car. He then handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag to the surveillance officers, adding that Gacy had told him, "The end is coming, these guys are going to kill me." Gacy then drove to the home of a fellow contractor and friend, Ronald Rode. Gacy hugged Rode before bursting into tears saying, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." Gacy left Rode, then drove to Cram's home to meet with Cram and Rossi. As he drove along the expressway, the surveillance officers noted he was holding a rosary to his chin and praying. After talking with Cram and Rossi, Gacy had Cram drive him to a meeting with his lawyers. Afterwards, Cram informed the surveillance officers that Gacy had told him and Rossi that he had confessed to over 30 murders with his lawyers the night before. Gacy then had Cram drive him to Maryhill Cemetery, where his father was buried. As Gacy drove to various locations that morning, police outlined the formal draft of their second warrant, specifically to search for the body of Robert in the crawl space. After hearing from surveillance detectives that Gacy was very erratic and might commit suicide, police decided to arrest him on a charge of possession and distribution of cannabis in order to hold him in custody while they waited for their second warrant to get approved. It was granted at 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, the day before Gacy's civil suit against the police was to take place. After police told Gacy that they were going to search his crawl space for Robert, Gacy denied the teenager was buried there, but confessed to having killed in self-defense a young man who was buried in his garage. As police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home, they found that Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, flooding the crawl space with water. To clear it, they simply replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. After he had done so, evidence technician Daniel Genty entered the crawl space and began digging. Within minutes, he had uncovered putrefied flesh and a human arm bone. After being informed that police had found human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air, adding that he had known his arrest was inevitable since the night before. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, in the presence of his lawyers, Gacy provided a formal statement in which he confessed to having killed about 30 young males, all of which he claimed had entered his house willingly. He claimed all were teenage male runaways or male prostitutes. Gacy claimed to have dug only of the 5 victims' graves in the crawl space and had his employees, including victim Gregory Godzik, dig the remaining trenches. When questioned specifically about Robert, Gacy confessed of luring him to his house and strangling him on December 11th. He also admitted to having slept alongside Robert's body that night before disposing of the body in the Des Plaines River in the early hours of December 13th. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23rd to pinpoint the precise spot where he threw his victims from. Gacy was then taken back to his home and instructed to mark his garage floor with orange spray paint to show where he had buried the individual he supposedly killed in self-defense, which he named as John Butkovich. To assist officers in the search for the victims buried underneath his house, Gacy drew a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where the bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from Gacy's crawl space within the next week. 3 more were unearthed elsewhere on his property. The bodies of Timothy, Frank, James, and Robert were eventually found along the Des Plaines River. Robert was discovered on April 9th of 1979. Gacy was brought to trial on February 3rd of 1980, charged with 33 murders. Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors the year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests to determine if he was able and competent to withstand trial. Gacy attempted to convince his doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, civic civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman called Jack Hanley, which he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy had confessed to the police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and who viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty on reason of insanity. They presented Gacy as this Jekyll and Hyde character. 3 psychiatric experts at Gacy's trial testified that they found him to be a paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. The prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. They produced several witnesses to testify to the premeditation of Gacy's actions and the efforts he took to escape detection. Cram and Rossi both testified that Gacy had made them dig trenches and spread lime in his crawl space. Both said Gacy would look into the crawl space to make sure that they did not deviate from the exact spots that he had marked. Jeffrey Rignall testified on behalf of the defense on February 21st. He wept repeatedly while describing Gacy's torture of him in March of 1978. On February 29th, Donald Voorhees, whom Gacy sexually assaulted in 1967, testified against Gacy, mentioning Gacy's attempts to stop him from testifying by having a kid spray mace in his face and beating him up. Robert Donnelly testified the week after Donald Voorhees. This was over his assault in December of 1977. Donnelly was visibly distressed and on the verge of breaking down multiple times while describing what happened to him. As Donnelly testified, Gacy repeatedly laughed at him. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to the judge asking for a mistrial. It didn't happen. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty on 33 counts of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both convictions in reference to Robert. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. Gacy was sentenced to death for each murder he committed. His execution was set for June 2nd of 1980, and he was transferred to the Menor Correctional Center, where he remained incarcerated on death row for 14 years. After his incarceration, Gacy read numerous law books and filed many motions and appeals, although he did not succeed in any of them. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14th. Gacy kept filing appeals and kept seeking new trials and just trying over and over again to stop his execution. His final appeal was in October of 1993. The Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10th of 1994. On the morning of May 9th of 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. He observed prayer with a Catholic priest before being escorted to the execution chamber to receive a lethal injection. There were actually complications with the execution. The chemicals used had solidified. 10 minutes later, after replacing the tubes, the execution continued. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Gacy's final statements to his lawyers before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others, and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, there was a crowd of about 1,000 people outside the correctional center. A vocal majority favored the execution, and there was a small amount against the death penalty. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th of 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated. Only 28 of Gacy's victims were conclusively identified. Of these, the youngest were Samuel Stapleton and Michael Marino, both 14. 5 victims have never been identified. The most recent victim that was identified was 21-year-old Francis Wayne Alexander, who was previously known as Body 5. He was identified in just October of 2021. He had not been reported missing by his family, who believed he had relocated from Chicago to California shortly after his final contact with his mom in November of 1976. And that is all I have for you today on John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. With that being said, in the comments below, I want to know what you're thinking, what you were feeling. Just let it all out. Personally, I say this so many times in so many of these videos, and it's sad and it sucks sucks because it's so true. So many of this could have been prevented had officials just taken it seriously from the get-go or listened to people that were saying, you need to look into this. The fact that his own parole in Iowa didn't know that he was off abusing and sexually assaulting boys back in Illinois is insane. He was supposed to serve a 10-year prison sentence and he didn't. It's sad and it blows my mind, and those people out there, like the parents that were like, you need to look into him, is even more sad. I was reading about this and researching, and I actually found that some neighbors of his reported just constantly being waken up at night because his lights were turning on and off, his car was coming late or leaving late, and that they would even hear like muffled screams. And they didn't know if it was his house, they would just hear that in the neighborhood, and they were obviously neighbors of him. And it's like, if someone had just said something, maybe he could have been stopped sooner. If someone had just taken things seriously, maybe he could have been stopped sooner. It sucks. And that's sadly the case for a lot of these serial killers, but that's also how it was back in the 70s, 80s, 90s when all of this was mainly going down. Either way, this is it, guys. This is my last episode of my Zodiac serial killer series, and I generally do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and please let me know. Wow, what a year. I cannot believe it's been a year already. Either way, shout of the day goes to Harriet on Instagram. Thank you so much. If you would like to be shout of the day, just follow me on my Instagram and stay active. Once again, thank you for watching this series. If you are new, if you're watching it for the first time, maybe you've only ever seen this episode, you can go check out the rest of the series in my Zodiac serial killers playlist on my channel. It is a serial killer for every single zodiac sign that exists. So the first one I ever started with was an Aries serial killer, and this was of course my Pisces serial killer, so we have officially come full circle. If you guys would like to see more videos like this, I recommend checking out my Halloween content. That's usually when I do more crime, murder, mystery stuff, so definitely go check that out, and of course subscribe for more if you want to see more. But all that being said, I will see you guys next time. Bye!